Lavender Literary Society members and guests, welcome and good evening. Today we are honored to present Garrard Conley's book, All the World Beside, a novel that recounts the love story of two men living in a 17th century utopian community in Puritan New England at a time when religious zealotry threatens their relationship and their lives. Garrard will be in conversation with writer and journalist Meredith Talusan. My name is Suhaili Bautista Carolina. I'm the Chief of Programs at the American LGBTQ Museum, a new collaboration dedicated to preserving, researching, and sharing LGBTQ history and culture that will open its first physical galleries in New York City in 2027. I am a brown, Black woman. I have a yellow head wrap. I'm wearing gold hoop earrings and a red silk blouse, and I'm sitting by a window with the New York skyline behind me. While our first physical galleries are still 2 years into the future, our work as a museum is already underway. Over the past 2 years, we've produced a robust slate of free public programming with partners across the country, toured an award-winning exhibition to 5 major US cities, and launched our Lavender Literary Society book club, which you get to experience this evening. You can learn more about the American LGBTQ Museum at americanlgbtqmuseum.org. For those of you joining the Lavender Literary Society for the first time today, we'd like to begin by sharing a bit about our book club. The American LGBTQ Museum Book Club is a space for community and connection, bridging generations through the magic of storytelling. Our titles are a mix of popular queer history and memoir with inspiring authors and iconic guest facilitators. Through virtual and in-person gatherings, we aim to ignite intergenerational dialogue and foster understanding, empathy, and unity. Together, we traverse the landscapes of queer culture, savoring the nuances and complexities that make our stories uniquely ours. This isn't just a book club, it's a movement. Reading together becomes a powerful act and a catalyst for change, a testament to the resilience of the LGBTQ spirit. Participants will be a part of something extraordinary in this book club. We don't just read, we'll weave the threads of our stories into a tapestry of strength, resilience, and pride. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's author, Garrard Conley. Garrard Conley is the New York Times bestselling author of the memoir Boy Erased, as well as the creator and co-producer of the podcast Unerased, The History of Conversion Therapy in America. His novel, All the World Beside, was published last year, and his work has been published by the New York Times, Oxford American, Time, and Virginia Quarterly Review, among others. Conley is a graduate of Brooklyn College's MFA program, where he was a Truman Capote Fellow specializing in fiction. He's an assistant professor of creative writing at Tennessee State University and currently teaches on the MFA program at Bennington College. And we're also happy to welcome our host, Meredith Talusan, who you will hear from very shortly. Without further ado, we welcome Garrard and Meredith to the virtual stage.
Yay, we're
Hi,
here.
Garrett. Oh my God, they've left us alone to talk.
We should describe ourselves first.
Oh, right. Yes.
I am-
Why don't you start?
yeah, I'm a white cisgender man who is currently wearing a black woven shirt, and behind me is my kitchen, which is somewhat clean. That's my description.
Okay. Well, let's see. What is my description? I'm Meredith. I am a trans albino Filipina American woman who is woman and non-binary person. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns. I have blonde hair and very pale skin. I'm wearing reading glasses, and my blonde hair is on the longish side, and I'm wearing a blue and white checkered shirt. And I also have flowers that I grew from my garden in my in my frame, which connects to some of the themes of this book, in terms of beauty and characters who are appreciate beauty despite other people's judgments of them. And I think, like, before we get started talking, we talked about having you read from your wonderful book, and I feel like one of the most thrilling parts of All the World Beside is its language. So hearing your language is going to be a thrill, I'm sure.
Well, thank you, Meredith. Thank you, Suhali, and thank you, Lucy, for all of this, and thank you to the LGBTQ Museum, which I'm just so excited to see all open physical spaces soon. I can't wait to see that. So I'm going to read from a section kind of at the beginning of the book, and my character Nathaniel Whitfield, who is one of the main characters, is the patriarch of the family, who is in love with another man in his town. He's a minister, and he's in love with a physician named Arthur Whitfield, and he is having some troubles with that love and with reconciling that love with his understanding of his family. So we meet him after he's already fallen in love, and he is walking home from a sermon, and he's thinking about life. So here we go. It's on page 86 of my copy. Okay. Nathaniel Whitfield returns home by way of the forest path, his legs weak, his breath shallow. He has been fasting for days, fasting and praying and keeping a daily diary of his thoughts, his resolutions. As he steps over the roots blocking his path, the hunger draws him deeper into Christ's pain, ever closer to the mortification of his flesh. He pauses to rest his shoulder against the soft coils of a birch. A low sun filters through the honeyed leaves, prismed like precious quartz. Above the tops of the trees, tufts of silvered smoke rise like mist, so distant as to seem part of the fabric of the sky itself. Eyes unfocused, he begins to see the world behind this one, the one waiting for him in the next life, just beyond reach. A sweet taste floods his tongue, so sweet he might retch. He bends low, hands on knees, his gown straining against his legs. When the fiery dots swimming before his eyes begin to recede, he sees he is looking into the clearing. There is the circle of pines spaced so uniformly they might have been planted by a man. There is the even ground, a nearly perfect circle where red flowers bloom in spring like a blaze. And there is the fallen branch he has never moved, gnarled and twisted with twigs pointing upward like dead spiders' legs, marking the place where the two of them stood when he had allowed himself to meet Arthur with Ezekiel in his arms. He has not given in to temptation since they made their pact, yet on certain lonely days he has not been able to resist walking past this clearing. To his great surprise, Arthur kept up his end of the promise. He had stated things so plainly and carefully that Nathaniel had not even had to fight him on a single point. They had been standing in the middle of an empty street around midnight, the new moon their sole companion on the night watch. They had been walking together all night, an intimate quiet between them, when Arthur finally said, "I shall agree to your conditions, Reverend, because I want more than anything for our friendship to survive. That is my sole concern, far greater than anything else I feel for you. I wish to help you in this struggle of yours, for though I may not share the same struggle at the moment, I do understand it. The question rests between you and God, and the two of you must be free of all distraction." As Arthur's speech drew to an end, Nathaniel felt closer to him than ever, grateful for the freedom this selfless man had granted him. He wanted to kiss him in that moment, but seeing as they had reached such a sound agreement, he resisted, and in the resistance, he realized he was disappointed, angry even, that Arthur hadn't fought back. Where were his tears, his fists? Was it all so easy to give up? And then the next day, when Nathaniel saw Arthur talking to Judah Griggs, the physical ease between the two of them, doctor and patient, the cold lightning passing through his veins as he thought of the many opportunities Arthur might find when calling upon these men in their houses. He shakes his head clear of such thought. A breeze caresses the sweat of his neck, his brow. To the shadows of divine things he adds the wind's cooling touch, God's breath. His vision fully returned, he heads up the path, careful again with his feet. Ahead, through the crimson leaves, he sees the well and the garden beyond it, a sliver of the house he built with his own hands, its every clapboard another memory of the days he and Catherine stood together outside these half-built walls and envisioned a future in this town. As he draws nearer, the candlelight from the kitchen window fills his path, swelling as twilight descends, igniting the garden plants here and there with tiny sparks. Sarah passes before the window, her face aglow, so bright and youthful, as though the light issues from the surface of her skin. Catherine sits behind her at the work table, Ezekiel toddling slowly upon its surface with arms outstretched, Catherine's hands moving at something in her lap, a bit of stump work, no doubt, those lips that have always drawn him in, now pressed tightly in concentration. He pauses beside the well, a solitary figure in the dark, a shadow, a stranger. He watches them, this family he has made, framed within the leaded lights. Has he ever once considered what it is they do when he is gone? Has he ever imagined their lives without him? The answer comes suddenly like the boom of a musket. No, he is not. A deep shame rises in his gut. Again he tastes the sweet rot on his tongue, feels as though he might retch. He has led them here to this house. It is his job to keep them safe, never lead them astray. Yet in this moment he is a stranger to them, this happy family. Stop there.
Wonderful. Um, I feel like as in terms of just kind of as a place to start. Oh, also, by the way, folks who are tuning in, Lucy is going to be there's a Q&A feature on the Zoom, and you can please feel free to ask questions on the Q&A at any time. And I think it would be fun rather than, like just me asking all of my questions for people to, like I will try to bring up questions that come up from the chat. And also if you have any reactions or any comments about anything that we've talked about, please feel free to use the Q&A feature as well. We were talking before the panel that you can just add, what do you think, to the end of your comment, and it's already a question. But I think for me, one of the most evocative, first of all, Garrett and I are in writing group together, so I've seen drafts of the novel, but I think one of the enormous pleasures of getting to read it again in preparation for us talking is getting to read it as a reader, getting to read it without that, like without the sort of like thing in the back of your mind about like how to workshop it or how to improve it. And I think one of the things that really stands out to me is how much of an achievement and how difficult it must have been to simultaneously get this period language right, but also infuse it with, with all of this queer sensibility, which, which sort of straddles, right? Like this sort of sense of the sense of both being of the period, but also inevitably, kind of like the sensibilities of the modern and contemporary reader. And I was just wondering, kind of like how, first of all, how did that language develop for you? And I think also, like now that the book has been out for a little while, how like what do you hear now compared to, like to what you were hearing when you were, like when you were like closer to it than you are now?
You put your finger on the question. So much of writing All the World Beside was me reading travelogues or sermons by Jonathan Edwards, who was a very famous preacher at the time. And some of you may have been subjected to his most famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which is really the first fire and brimstone sermon that we really know of, or that's what we attribute it to. He was a very staid, quiet man, but that sermon was something that really started a lot of the Great Awakening. It was responsible for much of that. So I was reading a lot of those books, and I was diving into letters written between men at the time. And a really important aspect of the book was getting that language right because I knew without the voice, there was no way to find my way into it. And I think we, as contemporary queers, right, we have a way of speaking in a way, our way of speaking often signals, right? Like it's an insider speak. And so, how was I going to do that in an 18th century narrative with a minister who doesn't even know what he is, right? And extending that, how was I going to do that with someone I would consider to be gender non-conforming or non-binary, Ezekiel, his son? And how was I going to do that with depression in his wife, Catherine? So all of these, I had to get sort of the 18th century language, but I also had to get this sort of modern, contemporary queer sensibility inside the book. And honestly, I found it in a letter between two men that just opened the whole thing up for me. There was a letter from, what's his name? Something Maxey is his last name. And he's writing to his friend. It's early 18th century, or no, late 19th century, actually, this letter. And I found it in the Massachusetts Historical Society. And the letter said something along the lines of, I miss lying beside you each night. I want to feel you against me. And then he said, sometimes I reach for your doodle and end up touching the bedpost. And I thought, doodle, like, what is that? And so, of course, I went on an etymological journey with doodle, and it was what you think it is. And then, of course, there's the thought of, okay, well, if it's a doodle that can be mistaken for a bedpost, it's hardly in a state of repose, right? So, you gotta have to read through these lines into what they're actually saying, and then uh, Maxie signs off with, and this is just quoting, "Your cunt humble." And I thought, wow, okay, I knew that word was in Shakespeare, or Shakespeare was punning that word, but is that what they're meaning here? And the deeper I looked, the more I found it. And I feel like your cunt humble is some perfect combination of 18th century and current speech, right? Like you could find that on a Grinder profile today. It would definitely pique your interest if someone wrote that. And so it really opened this window into the book for me, and I allowed myself to have a leeway that I wouldn't have had earlier. And even with, I think Flannery O'Connor calls it like the blender effect, like when you just read a bunch of stuff and something comes out. And that's what I did with the 18th century and all these travelogues and things like that. But then, of course, because I was terrified, like I was like, what am I doing? I don't know how this is going to read. I was so in it, I was so deep into the language, that I had the writer Garth Greenwell do a style read, which you should be wary when you ask Garth Greenwell to do a style read, because it's gonna just, he's gonna find everything. And he found all the moments where the language had, I think, become a little too contemporary, and he knew the history of words, right? And so, with his help, I was able to sort of clarify some of the moments that might have read as too modern.
Mm.
But as to your second part of the question, Meredith, that how do I feel reading it now versus back then when it was still so raw? I feel happier with it, honestly, because I can't see all the mistakes,
Ooh.
or I can't see the things that would pull me out, in terms of the editing process, where I would be like, ugh, well, that word wasn't coined until, 19th century, so why am I using it? And sometimes I did choose words that were later, because there was no other word, really to describe it, but it was rare. So that's kind of where I ended up on it. And reading that passage, I was like, okay, I think that works.
Oh yeah, I mean it's just absolutely beautiful, and yeah, you have such an amazing gift for description. I also feel like we need to we need to replace Bussy and bring back Cunt
Yeah,
Humble,
and
right?
humble is where it's at.
um, like as you're talking and discussing the sort of just kind of like uh reading all of these accounts, right? Letters between men and, like these sermons, it does occur to me that there's this way that fiction kind of becomes the history that isn't, that doesn't necessarily get told, especially in a queer context, right? Just because of the fact that so much couldn't be said during that period. And, one of the things you said in your, I don't, is it a postscript? I can't remember, like
But
the
that
end, your
sounds
end note, like, is that so much of what we learn about queer people during this period is from police accounts. And I was wondering, like I was wondering if that resonates with you. And then also, for you, like um what do you think, how do you perceive the book as a contribution to history, if you perceive it
I mean,
in
that's
that
very
way?
rough, Meredith.
Um,
I hope that I contributed to an understanding of queer history. For me, if I thought of it that way, it was always too scary, you know? Um, but I became really frustrated in a great way. You know, when you're frustrated as an artist, that's when you know there's some friction and there might be something to do. And I was very frustrated, not only with the way some of these letters were overlooked by straight scholars, they were dismissed. You know, there was right after that letter was cited in another book, the scholar, his last name was Godbeer, which is such a great, name for for this topic. He said, "One cannot help but wonder after hearing Kant Humble." And I thought, one cannot help but wonder, okay, I've read a lot of letters between men and women that no one wonders about, when they say things like that. And then I ran across this amazing screed from Larry Kramer in the Gay and Lesbian Review in the early 2000s. And it was just like taking aim at that scholar who'd said one cannot help but wonder. And it, Larry Kramer is really good at a rant, and you don't always agree with everything, but it provokes. And I just thought, I am mad. I'm also mad that no one paid attention to these letters and that there's so much work to be done, and and like straight scholars weren't doing it, queer scholars are doing it now. So I definitely dove into some queer scholarship that did that work, but I didn't feel that it had been dramatized properly. And it's not that there are so many great books that are looking at historical periods and taking a queer lens to it. There's so many right now, and it's a really exciting time. But I felt like my particular understanding of religious fundamentalism and the the just tangled web of emotion that exists within those restrictive worlds was something I'm very good at writing about. Boy Erased, I hope, captured some of that internalized homophobia and some of the things that, I can't even read that book anymore because it's just so hard for me to go back into that mental space. But I know that mental space. And there was something exciting about sort of shifting the environment to 18th century and saying, okay, can we find the origins of where a lot of this came from? And of course, colonial America, like there's this dark story underneath the whole thing that's hinted at multiple times, which is the colonial project of eradicating native peoples on this land and educating them, quote unquote, in the Christian way. And I wanted to sort of draw a parallel between these different modes of education that were so-called education that people felt they needed to abide by. And, the details are astounding. Like, I thought I had it bad, but I didn't have to go up in front of an entire Congregationalist church and answer and recite Bible verses by heart to show that I didn't have the devil in me. Like, that's a different stage. It's a more
A
intense.
lot of pressure.
Yeah. And, just imagine if there's a love affair that's forbidden during that time. And imagine if you didn't fit into the gender norms, but you didn't have a language for it. Imagine with Catherine, Nathaniel Whitfield's wife, um, that you didn't have a language for your own depression. And so that challenge became really exciting for me after my frustrations sort of waned and I felt like I could do it.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat. Oh, and by the way, I would love for you to include your name when you ask a question, just so that, just so that we know who you are. And also, and maybe like where you're asking your question from. But there was a question about, like whether, like your own sort of
Mm.
way of writing, just sort of like in general, the casual correspondence has changed since working on this book and reading all of this material. But I think also like I want to tack on the question to that is how has working on the book changed you in general and the way that you perceive queer life and queer, and what queerness is and what queerness means.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, reading all those, I love reading letters. I mean, it was one of my favorite things in the research because Um, letters weren't private necessarily, but some of them were a little more directed toward one person, and those were my favorites. But the art of the letter, like we've really lost it in this generation. Um, it's something beautiful, and so I do take time now to write letters. I did kind of learn that from writing this, and sometimes I sign off with "You're kind humble," which is really fun. And so that's sort of the basic thing that's changed in terms of writing. But also, I think just in terms of my own life, like reading it, actually going to the Massachusetts Historical Society and touching these letters, which they allow you to do without gloves. I didn't know that, and it scared me. But, I'm like touching these really old documents and these things that feel really sacred to me because it feels as though I'm touching queer history. And um, it really gave me a kind of reverence for the subject and an understanding of queerness that was deeper than my very contemporary understanding. Um, I'm a big fan of this idea of, sort of the long haul. Like, it's going to take a long time for things to change, but and there's going to be immediate progress and then there's going to be immediate setbacks. But it was so wonderful to see this other world open up for me, this imaginative space of possibility where I just knew, on a deep guttural level, like queer people actually did exist. We're not just new inventions, right? And that was really important to me. And I hope that part of that comes across to the reader. But in my own life, it actually, I've been running away from religious experience my whole life. And that sounds crazy because of the books I've written. The books I've written are partially a way for me to get over it. But writing All the World Beside, and I don't even think it's quite present in this book, but after writing it, I began to pray. I didn't know to whom or to what universe. Um, but I felt somehow more connected to a longer history. Maybe I'm praying to, my queer ancestors. And there was something about ritual and reverence that I learned from writing this book that I think I've carried forward.
I'm just thinking about praying to Larry Kramer.
Oh, you'd get a missive back, a really loud, angry missive.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like he would definitely be an angry god.
It'd be great.
Um, yeah, like as you're talking, like I'm just thinking about the fact that um the fact like the sort of the way that when you talk about um like praying again, that there is this sort of um just in the book and in life in general, this desire for collectivity, right? And this desire for, you know, the great awakening, the fact that, you know, this group of 200 people, you know, banded together and came to Cana, and how important that is, and how that's one of the things that a lot of queer people miss, right? When so many of us leave the church. I was raised devout Catholic myself, and I was wondering how you you know, like how you've been affected, right? Like you talk about being affected by being in prayer, but how, like, what do you want people who come from religious backgrounds, how do you want them to feel, I guess, like
Oh, there was this
relative to the book?
this surprising thing that happened to me with the promotion of Boy Erased, and mostly when I was thrust into a much more public situation than I ever have been when the film came out of my memoir, and I suddenly was in huge crowds and people were coming up, you know, and I was sort of acting like it was still an author event, but people would come up and just sort of just tell me their trauma, and it was felt sacred to me. You know, I just took it in because it was so interesting to hear, and also to hear how our experiences were similar. And in fact, people would always come up and say, well, I didn't go through conversion therapy, but, and then everything they said was like beat for beat conversion therapy brainwashing. And so that was something that felt really sacred to me. But then I would hear from so many people that would describe themselves as either queer Christians or queer Muslims, or, you know, from any faith background. And at first, you know, I wanted to be like, what are you doing? Like, what are you doing? Like, this is, you know, get away. But then the more that I heard these people's stories, and really the profound way that they'd grappled with hateful things that had been tossed at them and still held on to their faith, it became something sacred for me too. And so in a way, All the World Beside was, I mean, I joked, but I think it's true. I was like, maybe I'll just dedicate this book to queer Christians. Like, it kind of feels like they don't have books sometimes. And there are a lot of, you know, queer Christian theologists and people online that you can find who are spreading that message of inclusion, but there aren't a lot of books like that. And so I wanted to allow for the possibility, you know, it's very skeptical. I think my book is very skeptical of organized religion. It certainly doesn't take the side of organized religion, but I don't believe it's truly skeptical of faith. I think that there's a scene between Nathaniel Whitfield, the minister, and Arthur, the physician he falls in love with, where they're in a cabin by themselves, and they look at the Bible together and they see the story of David and Jonathan. And you know, Nathaniel is very close-minded to it and saying, like, we can't turn the Bible into what we want it to be just to suit ourselves. That's selfish. And Arthur is saying, but you know, it's here, you know, the place where we can be ourselves is already in this room. And I mimic that a couple of times in the book. There are these spaces that feel sacred to me in the book, like the cabin, even though it's in a horrible place. I mean, it's on the edge of a town where they are trying to convert native religions into Christianity. So there's an ugly thing happening right outside, and these two men are part of it. But they found this space that makes them start to question even that. You know, I didn't push that too far because of the reality of the time. These men would not be as intelligent on that subject as we are, or as aware. But but I wanted to sort of show the reader that there were these spaces where if you begin to shed the lies that you've been told about yourself and about the world you're in, everything starts to unravel, right? So like your dearly held concepts about, you know, our mission to um, help these Native Americans become Christian, right? It becomes something that might be questioned. And later in the book, I don't want to give too much away if everyone hasn't read it, but there's a room that Nathaniel has been interested in and returns to, and he looks at it through a keyhole, and inside the keyhole, through the keyhole, he sees the scene of queer joy and sex, and something that you would see in sort of certain clubs today, or gatherings at people's houses, sort of an orgy situation, but something that he interprets at first.
Maybe, perhaps.
Yeah. I know nothing about them. And so, he sees this vision, and the first time he sees it, it's disgusting to him, and he feels sick. And then later in the book, there's a sort of return to that moment, where it's seen as something beautiful and sacred and mysterious. And so I'm kind of leaving this keyhole in the book for people to see, like, utopia, first of all, doesn't exist, right? The idea of utopia, which is, they're all obsessed with this idea of utopia and having a perfect, cleansed community where everyone is sacred and everyone is beautiful. Well, not going to happen, right? It's human life. That's not going to happen. But there are these spaces that are often unexpected. In my life, they've been unexpected. These moments where I feel like I've sort of transcended into this timeless space, and you don't really expect them, but they exist. And they exist in our lives today, even when everything horrible is going on. There are these beautiful spaces that open up, and in the past they existed. And so I sort of wanted to show that we think when I wrote this book, I feel like we were in a different moment in the
Mm.
country. And so I'm sort of glad that I wrote it the way that I did, um, because I wanted to show that progress is not a straight line, and we're not necessarily, it's not easy to put it on an axis of like better or worse. I mean, certainly we can say certain things were much worse for queer people in the past. But there are things that are lost too. There are histories that have been lost and that we need to reclaim. And we need to find those spaces that opened up in different time periods and say, those are ours too. And sort of string them along together and look at them and say, like, here's what we are. We're not just now, we've been here forever.
I feel like I have like five, six different questions. But the thing that comes to mind immediately is I notice that there's a lot of peeping and eavesdropping in
A
the book.
lot.
And I was just wondering, like how intentional that was, and like what you were thinking when you
So,
had these like delicious, wrote all of these delicious peeping and eavesdropping scenes.
well, I mean, never trust me to be alone in your house, because I will just go through things. I like warn people before. I'm like, I will try, but like put your things away. Um, so that's just partially a personal thing of mine. I've always been so curious about people, in every way. When they don't have a mask on, I'm always interested. But aside from that, 18th century literature, everything from, the earliest 18th century novels, they've always had keyholes and people listening in. And so part of it was a genre thing where I was like, this is like part of that tradition. So I like to do that. But I think that in addition to that, I think it's trying to show how, um, we have to sort of look outside. We have to look in unusual places, and even in slightly less ethical means, sometimes queer people have to do that. I've written, and my next novel that I'm writing has, you know, over eavesdropping, overhearing. There's a lot of that, and and I just think it's like a preoccupation of mine. I think that it's really interesting.
Well, and gossip is definitely like a big aspect of the queer community. I mean, I think one of the other aspects of the book that I love is that when we're talking about queerness, we're talking, in the book, we're talking about it in all of these different forms, right? Not just Nathaniel and Arthur, but also Ezekiel, but also other characters. I'm not sure how much I can give away. So, you know, and I'm yeah, like I'm wondering how that fits into your vision, both for the book and also just in general as an author.
How what exactly fits?
How that kind of vision of a queer community that isn't, you know, because there are definitely, as we know, like a lot of books that focus on one specific
Yeah.
identity or one specific segment
Oh,
of queer
yeah.
community.
That's such a great question. Well, I knew from the beginning, and maybe this is the wrong way to write a book, but I was just so intrigued by the challenge of having every single one of my main characters in the Whitfield family, Nathaniel, his wife Catherine, his daughter Sarah, and his son Ezekiel, be queer in some way. Um, and I use that term broadly, like Sarah, I do see Sarah as maybe like a proto-lesbian, or, like I feel like she's not figured it out yet. But she is going against her father's wishes to preach as a woman, which was very forbidden at the time. We have a lot of historical examples of that, like Anne Hutchinson, who dared to disagree with the men in her community, and was banished and then ended up dying alone. So there were a lot of warnings for girls like that. Um, and I felt like that was queer in a way, and with Catherine, I don't know what her sexuality really is, but her depression and her way of sort of just submitting to the tide of sort of a Virginia Woolf depression, um, felt very queer to me. And I wanted to sort of see how these characters who were so different, from everyone else in town, even though everyone else in town had these things too, how they could either come together or be pulled apart by the situations that people get entangled in. So that was really important to my vision of the book. I think that maybe a more successful and more linear book would have been Nathaniel and Arthur's love story with lots of sex. But I was really just interested in how expressing freedom in one aspect of the family would affect the rest of the family, and how would they feel compromised by someone else's freedom and maybe curb their own freedom or use their own sense of freedom in a very bizarre way, um, to sort of combat this. So yeah, it was, I mean, that sounds very intellectual, but I just thought like, what if we just had this queer family together and they look like a sort of modern day nuclear family. And that was, I, I think I'm always interested in community in the ways that people aren't talking about it. Um, I feel like there's a big emphasis in the queer community, rightly so, on found family and on joy. And when people sort of cross the boundaries that you set, they're out. It's like we're here, this is a safe space, and everyone else go over there. And so I was really interested in what happens if they stick together, right? Because they feel like they have to. And I think part of what I want in my own queer community is like people to mess up and for us to have accountability and talk about it and still love that person. And I do think so much of the queer community does that, but like the popular version of that doesn't at all. And it's, there's like a celebration when you like rid yourself of someone who's toxic, which I get, but also not interesting to me on a literary or even a
Right.
personal level, because I remember I grew up very brainwashed. I went to conversion therapy. When I went to college, I said all the wrong things. I probably judged people that were very similar to myself. And I remember my instructors, my professors sitting me down for hours and explaining to me why what I said was not helpful. And I thought that was an act of great love and kindness. And I just really am fascinated by that in our own community.
Everyone, please don't be shy. I can talk to Garrett for hours and hours, but I would love to to incorporate some of your questions and input. Um, but uh, like as you're talking, I'm thinking about, well, first of all, I think you're being way too modest when you alluded to writing the book wrong and also the book not being successful. Like I don't know what metric of success you
I don't either, Meredith.
the
I'm
book
just
the book is I think the book is enormously successful, and and whatever, and we all know that contemporary reception of books doesn't bear any like any prediction in terms of how it stands the test of time.
thank you
Moby
for
Dick
therapy
being
session.
a huge example of that, right? But also, like, I wanted to, when since we're talking about like various identities within the queer community, can we talk about Ezekiel and, Ezekiel as a character, Nathaniel's child, and how you um, wanted to situate Ezekiel both within the period, but also, like clearly as somebody who a contemporary reader would see as either trans or non-binary, certainly within the trans spectrum, right?
I mean, Ezekiel is by far my favorite character. Um, I think that it was difficult to write Ezekiel for a few reasons, mostly because it was the 18th century and, gender was seen as so different from today. So how was I going to have this kid growing up in this very oppressive environment start to recognize things about themselves that would open up a new possibility of gender? And, I did it through scenes with Ezekiel's sister, Sarah, sort of dressing Ezekiel up in dresses and that feeling when the dress was on Ezekiel's body and looking in the mirror and really seeing themselves for the first time. That was really important moment to establish for the reader, like, okay, here's where we are. I'm not going to say it directly, and then later, Ezekiel decides that that's not even enough. Ezekiel will be known as nobody and will have no gender and no, no ties to the world, which I felt is something that I'm always interested in. Like we've talked about this, Meredith, and every time we're in here, I end up saying something about this. But, like when I introduced myself as a cisgender man, I was like, like I
Yeah,
don't.
no, I had a reaction. I was
I
just like,
Well, I just felt like I needed to like say what it looked like, Um,
maybe
but
you present as a
yeah,
cisgender man.
present as
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
And it's like comfortable for me to just stick with that right now. I don't want a public sort of discussion around it. But I think I put a lot of that into Ezekiel, because I felt a lot of that before. And really, like it always ends up where I'm just like, I would like to be like nothing. I would like to like not be legible, and I would like people to not remark on it, and I would like to just go through life, which, we can analyze that in terms of psychoanalysis, but I won't. And so I think that was how I handled Ezekiel, but he became my favorite character in many ways because um he takes sort of the biggest step. He leaves the town, he leaves it all behind. He experiences this other world, and then comes back to it as a different person and as someone who's really not going to compromise who he now knows himself to be. And this is such a great moment for me in the book because it's like Sarah, who didn't compromise her vision against her father and and really like became a preacher in many ways, even if she was limited in her abilities. Ezekiel comes in and like they're fighting at the end. And I thought, what a great ending. I mean, sorry to give it all away, but like what a great ending because um they would be, they're siblings and they're headstrong and they're stubborn and that was really important to me to show these different aspects of queerness for each character, including a gender nonconforming or trans character. Like, yeah, this character is still kind of an ass sometimes, and made a selfish choice that was also not selfish. And the choices we have to make as queer people can seem cruel to people that are outside the experience. And I wanted to sort of show that it's both cruel and not, you know.
Mhm. The question that just came through, I think, will be perfect as a final question, so I'm gonna hold it. But I was wondering, like as you're talking about the interaction between Sarah and Ezekiel, like one of the things that feels, like of course I can't help but read every novel as a writer, both as a writer and as a reader, right? And as a writer, one of the things that I just found really breathtaking about the book is how intricate the structure is, and how it interacts with these various family members and also like their loved ones, right? Like how they weave in and out of each other's lives.
Mhm.
What was that process like? Trying to, you know, to like weave all of these narratives together and and make all of them satisfying, and what and how did you come up with the with the convention of the letter, right? Like there's just like all of these like amazing structural moves that you make, and the seasons, et cetera, et cetera. Can you talk about
Yeah.
like the magnificence of structure in this book?
You. The mess of structure when I was writing it, because I think it had like seven different full rewrites. At one point the book was more focused on Nathaniel, and then my interest changed, and I had to find a structure that felt both true to the 18th century. Like I love, if y'all haven't read Jordy Rosenberg's Confession of the Fox, I love that kind of stuff. It's very daring structurally and playful with the language. And I found that to be very, very true of the 18th century. And I also, it's very like Tristram Shandy in a way, which is very bizarrely structured. So I wanted to have a playfulness, first of all, like, okay, there's gonna be letters in this, there's gonna be time jumps, there's gonna be um, some daring structural choices, like midway through the book we have the Great Awakening explodes, and when the Great Awakening explodes, the book becomes almost omniscient for a brief period of time. And I knew that I could only bring in the omniscient voice when the explosion happened. And the explosion occurs through the body. That's sort of my theory about the Great Awakening. And it's not just mine, it's many people's, is that the bodily freedom that was suddenly allowed, sort of shaking, jumping up in these stayed spaces where everyone was so still all the time, released something erotic into these communities, and they were allowed to sort of, writhe on the floor and gesticulate wildly. And I think that whether or not you choose to call that erotic or whatever, it's of the body, right? It's coming out of the body. So I knew that when the Great Awakening happens, it needed to be from the body, and then from there, the voice of omniscience could come in. Um, a sort of sexy voice, I thought, anyway. And but sexy and dangerous. And so that was like a big structural challenge for me, is how do I do that practically? How do I do that without making the reader roll their eyes and go, "Oh my God, he's reaching too far." And I don't really know if I did that. I hope I did. And then I sort of knew that things had to be revealed, breadcrumbed through the book, like Nathaniel Whitfield's own relationship to sexuality in the past when he lived in London as a child. That was not revealed until like midway through the book, and we get almost a scene with it. And that was a choice on my part to not put that up front, to put it later, because I wanted it to be revealed almost to him anew in this new perspective. Because as I said earlier, when he saw that, orgiastic explosion behind the keyhole, he saw it as shameful. And so when he returned to it, I wanted somebody like Arthur to be beside him saying like, actually, maybe this is interesting. And so by the end of the book, which I don't want to give too much away, but we have Arthur returning to that house that Whitfield has mentioned. And that return was really important for the structure of the book because I felt like this is the queer space. Like this is the space that is unabashedly queer. It was safe for these particular types of men, and he is now in it, having learned something very different. So yeah, I don't really know how it all came together, just that I knew that it needed to mimic, the structure needed to mimic what the revelation was in Whitfield.
As you're talking and just like imagining how beautiful it is to like map the structure of the book, just because as you're talking, I realize that like there are a lot of things where, like you hear just like a really tiny nugget of information, but then it gets exploded later and it has implications later, or a person is like thinking about something that happened rather than us, kind of like witnessing it, but then, like we end up witnessing it later through another character's eyes, so there's just like all of this, just sort of like really beautiful intricacy in the book.
I love returning to things. I love it.
Yeah, like I'm really kind of like seeing the loop
Yeah.
kind of structure now. Like I feel like
And you
that,
mentioned the flowers. I mean, flowers become so important throughout the book.
yeah. Yeah. Like it's a symbol, really, right? Like of kind of like uh, of how fervent people
Mhm.
can be about their beliefs, that they deny basic, natural beauty, right?
Yeah, they turned, everyone in these communities, they had a working garden, right? Which is great. I love a working garden. I like for my garden to feed me. But the Whitfields had something different. They had a little bit of color in their garden, and they also had, strange things that people wouldn't have thought of, based on the cravings that Catherine had when she was pregnant. And they have an ormolu clock, like this beautiful ornate clock, in their house that they hide when people come over because they realize that, oh, this little moment of beauty is too much for people to look too rich and too out of place. And so I wanted these little moments of aesthetic beauty to be both beautiful and suspect in the book.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to make like a funny connection, but I was wondering
Do it.
whether the desire for literary beauty has any connection to your desire to write fiction. Just because I don't know about you, like I'm also writing fiction, but one of the things that I found frustrating as a memoirist is the over focus on what happened to my life rather than like how I told the story of my life, that almost kind of like becomes an afterthought, or people would just be like, oh, like that was so, like elegantly put or like well written or whatever, as if
Yeah.
it just kind of like comes forth. Whereas with fiction, I think people have more of a tendency to focus on to sort of like look at all of the aesthetic and craft choices
Uh,
that one has made. Do you think that does
I
that
think
resonate with
people,
you, and what do you think of it?
oh,
Um,
totally. And I think that people look at I think both of our books have suffered from this, right? They got quite a bit of attention, and everyone always just talked about the subjects, right? And I don't know about you, but I've had writers come up to me and go, "Wow, your sentences are really great." And I'm like, "Yeah, I worked really hard on the sentences, actually." It's almost as if they're surprised that you could make something beautiful out of something that's so topical. Um, so yeah, I mean, currently, I guess I can sort of shift into, I don't know if we're ready to shift into the last question, but this does concern something.
well, we can do the last question, but then there's still an opportunity to have a last question. So if you're
So,
daring to have like we can have an epilogue question.
okay,
Yeah.
perfect. It's very 18th century to do that.
Yes.
I think that lately I've been so preoccupied with aesthetics and beauty in writing that I've begun to grow tired of it. And I almost want to puncture that and play with it and see what comes out of me when I don't focus on that foremost. Um, so this was kind of, I feel like All the World Beside was my like attempt to write really beautiful sentences. And I feel like my next project, I wanted it to be funny and weird and like the texture to kind of like the texture would contain the beauty rather than the individual sentences, like all of it coming together would seem beautiful. I mean, ideally you would do both. Like, but I'm not Nabokov. I'd love to be one day, but I feel like there's something about beauty that I distrust sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Um, the lull, the like the nursery rhyme aspect of it that just sort of brings you into it. And I think, a perfect writer, of course, is like, Virginia Woolf, who does both, who interrupts that beauty and also makes it beautiful at the same time. And so I'm really interested in how to do that. And I guess I'll transition to some of the new novel. I don't
Yeah,
want
you can. Yeah, you can. Well, actually, I will ask one
to.
last question before you transition, that your response reminded me of. I once did an event with Paul Yoon, and he was asked, like how he comes up with the tone of his writing, and he says, whatever I write, I picture it as a work of art. Uh,
Hmm.
and then I think of that work of art as I'm writing, and so that's like my kind of
So
signpost.
an actual a work of art that's like he's matching it to something
Not
else.
one that exists, like one that's in his
Oh,
mind as like a, so if you pick, can you picture all the world beside as a work of art? What would it be, and what would your new novel
that's
be as a
really
work of art?
helpful. That's really helpful. I'm gonna be thinking about
I
that.
know, no, no, I've
Wow.
been I've been really obsessed with it ever since he said
I'm
that.
a very visual person. Something that I do that's really strange is I sort of self-hypnotize when I write with like a string and I look at it and I sort of visualize whatever I'm seeing. So this is perfect for me. Um, yeah, I want to do that. But for this new novel, I won't talk a lot about the plot or anything, but I can talk about the research I've been doing, which I think is fun. Since I was a little kid, I watched on TV on the Trinity Broadcasting Network, which is this super Christian televangelist network, started by Tammy Faye, um, and sort of expanded by Jan Crouch, who, if anyone, you can look her up. It's wild. She has like the biggest pink hair, like platinum pink hair, and she has like more makeup than Tammy Faye. And I remember watching her when I was younger and being completely obsessed with her. It's no surprise that drag queens mourned her death, by the way. Um, and I found this article on her years later, where she had been approached by her granddaughter who said that someone at the network had raped her, and she told that granddaughter to be quiet because God would not want that for the ministry. And I thought, what a fascinating story, right? And what would it take? Jan Crouch did the wrong thing, but what would it take for someone to even consider doing the right thing in that situation? Someone with power, someone who had manufactured faith for that many years, told so many lies that they don't even know who they are anymore. Like you look at her and there's a genuineness to her performance. Like it feels very genuine. And I think in my imagining, when I watched her performances, I was like, she really believes this. Like she really has had to make herself believe this in order to do this. So, what would it do if I took a character like that and punctured that slowly throughout the book and made them sort of, and the question of the book became, um, you know, do people ever give up power and do the right thing? Is it possible? And that's a question for our moment, right? politically and artistically. Like, what are we willing to give up in this moment after we've worked so hard? I think for research, I didn't have to look any further than Boy Erased. I have told that story probably 1,000 times. I'm not even joking. And one year it was like 200 events in one year. And I told it over and over and over again. And each time it was a little different. It was all true, but it was like a little different. And the inflection was different. The memory was different. I have no access to who I was back then, almost. Like I just have this like myth version. And I thought, oh, okay, that's Beulah's experienced that. That's her name in the book. And yeah, that's sort of where I'm going with this next book. It's a lot of fun to write, and I'm trying to have some dark humor in it, mixed in with, all the same things you've found in my work already, religion and sexuality. That's where it's going to be.
It is kind of fascinating that these two books are very different, but the one thing they have in common is that the central character is a public figure who has a lot of ambivalence about their public the
I mean, my
about,
dad is a preacher to 200 people in Mountain Home, Arkansas. I grew up with it. Performance has been in my life from the beginning, and a lot of times what makes me a great teacher and a great speaker is learning from him, learning from this very flawed person who, taught me, for better or worse, how to do it.
Mhm. Well, it doesn't seem like we have any other questions. If there are no other questions, going once, going twice, okay. I feel like it might be time to pass the mic on back to Suhaili. But thank you so much, Garrett, for the conversation and for the opportunity to read your book, to reread your book. And thank you to the LGBTQ Plus Museum and to Suhaili and Lucy and everybody involved. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you both so much. Thanks to everyone for joining us for this evening's edition of the Lavender Literary Society Book Club with Garrard Conley and Meredith Talusan for All the World Beside. If you haven't yet, please order your copy of Garrett's book. Maybe you could order all of Garrett's books. Why not? Like, let's just do it. From our partners, Rep Club LA, Rep Club offers a 10% discount to all Lavender Literary Society members. So go over to their website, use the code Lavender10 at checkout, and then you'll be able to cop Garrett's book and all of the books in Lavender Literary Society that we've read over the last 2 years. We have some really exciting ALM programs coming up. So for book club, we usually take a break in the summer. We'll be publishing a summer reading list with titles that have come from previous authors. So that's very exciting. So follow us on social media so you can get a glimpse at what we are recommending in terms of queer content to read and take to the beach this summer. We'll be back in October with 2 exciting book clubs. Eric Watts' Love Your Asian Body, AIDS Activism in LA. And then we're also part of the Lesbian Lives Conference, and we'll be doing an author talk there for The Dream of a Common Movement, which was edited by Amy Hoffman and Jyotsna Vad with Masha Gessen. And so that's exciting. Those are 2 author talks that are happening in October. So for all the book club members, please save the date. And then we have 3 really exciting programs happening in August, and my colleague Lucy will help add links to the chat so you all can RSVP and save the dates. On August 14th, we're doing a program called Reverb Queer Core, a history of the punk subculture movement that happens in collaboration with Culture Lab LIC in Long Island City, Queens. Please come out. This is going to be a really, really exciting program around queer punk. And we'll have some queer punk bands playing that evening and learning a little bit about the history of that. So please join us for that. On August 16th, just 2 days later, if you're not sick of us yet, Please join us for a program called Continuum, a celebration of ballroom. There'll be a teach-in in part one of the day, and then a mini ball that you can participate in part two. This is a collaboration with the Leslie Lohman Museum of Art and Project for Empty Space. There's some exciting ballroom icons involved in this program. So if you are a lover of ballroom culture, please don't miss this program happening on Saturday, August 16th. And then finally, to close out our August, we are collaborating with the Alice Austin House on August 30th for a program called Love Machine. It's a day of conversation, workshopping, dance, performance, queer garden tours that are taking place from 12 to 4 on the occasion of Jasmine Morel's show culminating, which is called The Serpent, the Medicine, and the Invisible Devil. That is a lot of information. Please follow us, sign up for our newsletter, follow us on social media. This is how you kind of will tap in to what's happening at the American LGBTQ plus Museum. So thanks again to Meredith. Thanks to Garrett. Everyone have a great evening, and we look forward to welcoming you at upcoming programs at the American LGBTQ plus Museum. Thanks, everyone.
You everyone.